Taylor for that introduction. And we've basically already laid some good groundwork in terms of the reality that we're currently living in and the wider context that surrounds this discussion. I'm going to do a little lead in to set some additional context and then ask Pavel and Anne to just basically have a nice casual conversation. You know, they are vast resources of knowledge on all of these topics we're going to discuss today, so we're going to defer to them as much as possible. So thank you, Anne and Pavel, for joining us.
Of course.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers. We were already well into the era of quote unquote big data when COVID-19 began to drive even more of our daily activities into the online space. A result of that is technologies with access to significant user data have seen increasing value over this time, and debates around ethical issues of personal data related to the development of contact tracing apps have also ignited since the pandemic. According to survey data, the vast majority of Canadians are concerned about how companies or organizations use information about them online. And those under 35 are more likely to express concerns around that. So given that context and the bit of introduction that John provided around privacy by design and introducing Anne, perhaps you two could just speak a bit more on any specifics of privacy by design you want to raise further, and particularly why it's important to consider privacy by design in early stages of business development.
Oh, well, if I may start, the whole point of privacy by design was to introduce privacy protective measures proactively, upfront, before any harms had arisen. So it was a model of prevention, much like a medical model of prevention, where you want to prevent the harms from arising. When I first became commissioner in my very first term, what concerned me was that the laws that were in place ensured regulatory compliance after the fact, after there was a data breach or a privacy infraction. And to me, that was too little too late. So I wanted something to complement regulatory compliance after the fact. And literally at my kitchen table over 3 nights, I came up with privacy by design. I'm a psychologist, that's my background. So I think of things very differently than lawyers do. And I have great respect for the law, but I wanted something to complement regulatory compliance. And we had great luck with privacy by design. It's been translated into 40 languages. It was made an international standard in 2010. And as you mentioned earlier, it's now included in the new EU law, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is like huge. So what I am excited about privacy by design is that it allows you to engage in multiple interests, privacy and security, privacy and business interests, not one versus the other. I hate the old zero-sum dated model of win, lose, either or. No, you get rid of that. It has to be privacy and that's what we've been able to achieve through privacy by design in the last 10, 20 years. I'll switch it over to you, Pavel. I don't want to take up all the time.
No, I mean, I think it's an excellent sort of contextual, introduction. And I mean, as I was thinking about for this session, and I think most of the participants are entrepreneurs in different fields. So I was thinking about, what is it that we are seeing, and I can speak for myself. We're seeing a lot of activity both in the commercial space as well as public government space around digital transformation. If you think about what just happened with COVID, I think most of the folks on this call would probably agree that COVID just accelerated that digital transformation, because without it we can no longer do trade or have a relationship. With digital transformation, organizations got to be using data in their day-to-day decision, whether it's client or customer facing or employee value creation. So I think at this point in time, what are the key value drivers? The key value drivers are obviously digital revenue. The key value drivers are the brand and that an organization want to establish and protect, and then the internal culture and talent attraction and retention in this digital era. So if you think about those three things, this conversation is the center of those three things. You cannot generate digital revenue, you cannot maintain a brand, and you cannot attract a top talent and retain them and create a culture without paying attention to some of the macro topic around privacy, around ethics, and in fact, I would say around a sustainable business world. So to me, that's how I started to think about these conversations. And Sam, lead us through your next set. But I think that's how I would think about these topics versus perhaps, Anne, what you're referring to, how people were thinking about it in an isolated way. The macro is very important. And these topics are at the central of that macro theme.
Oh, of course, but let me be clear. When I talk to businesses, the whole point of embedding privacy protective measures into your operations is to increase the value of your brand. That's what we're trying to achieve. We want to ensure that you can gain a competitive advantage by embedding much needed privacy into your operations, which builds trust. That's what I've heard back from people who've gotten certified for privacy by design companies. They've told me it builds trust like no other. And that's the thing that's lacking. There's such a trust deficit right now. So anything you can do to enhance trust and create trusted business relationships, they value enormously.
Yeah, both very good points. And I've heard recently Facebook, in terms of talent retention, with issues surrounding privacy and how essentially they have steered their platform, and over the past couple of years, they're hard to retain top talent, and people are now following a bit more with the companies that kind of respect that culture. So while we're in this conversation, why don't we go into how technology companies or startups can foster a culture that is focused on privacy and ethics? So what kind of things can leadership to missions and values that can be done in order to get that culture more ingrained in this industry?
I would say one of the essentials is to embed privacy as the default setting in your operations, meaning you have great respect for your customers and you only use their personal information in ways that they have consented to. That you don't, just because you may have a central database containing tons of personal information, that doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want with that information and use it for additional secondary uses that were never consented to. Consent is absolutely critical on the part of data subjects. And once you can convey that to your customers, that you have great respect for them, you will only use the personal information that they have given you for the primary purpose of the data collection that they have consented to. And that if down the road you want to use their information for additional secondary uses, you'll come back to them to obtain additional consent. That builds trust like no other. And increasingly, with the mounting surveillance that's been taking place over the last few years, this is huge. And companies, big companies like Microsoft, IBM, they're changing their methodology in terms of the personal identifiers that are used from their customers. There's this whole movement now. It's called Decentralized Identity Foundation. And companies like Microsoft, who I've been working with, are creating decentralized identifiers that don't reside with the company who can do whatever they want with it. No, it resides under the control of the data subject, the individual. They decide what you can do with it. And it can reside in a secure enclave, in a cloud, or whatever. But the control resides with the individual. And that's what privacy is all about. It's about personal control over the use and disclosure of your information. So I think that gives great strides in terms of moving forward in the future.
Sam, if I want to sort of add what Anne just said, and to your question around what can leaders do, if you take a step back, there's before a company's formed, there are macro codes of the society, right? That we all sign up to. That's why we're a citizen of a country or our community. Within that macro code, then there would be a sort of within a company's bound, the characteristics of the corporation and a business code. I think these sort of things are foundational. This is not about ethics. It's not about privacy. This is just what is the value of this organization, and I think it starts there because once that's established and agreed upon by the different stakeholders and shareholders and employees of the organization, then it's about, okay, now that we're getting into digital world, which really we can bucket it in data and technology. In my case, I'm mostly focused on hybrid cloud and AI. Now that we're talking about hybrid cloud and AI implementation for a set of products via a set of channels, how would we bring in that macro code and the corporate characteristics and business values, right? I think that's how we should see it. It's a continuation of those goals, those values, those principles that form the company. Now it just needs to show in the applications that we're building or in the products that we are creating. Whether we monetize data via an application or whether we monetize data through second-party, third-party, fourth-party marketplaces. That's how a culture and leadership should look at it, so that it's easy to communicate and easy to execute.
It seems like both of you are touching on intentionality behind a lot of activities and business practices as being kind of the driving force that needs to be done. And so and whether it's the intention that you were pointing out of only using data for the explicit purpose that you're gone from right at the outset, and if anything further, you be transparent in that follow-up. And as my work in a nonprofit, we often are trying to pivot and use the data we maybe already collected in a way that can answer other questions. And while it's definitely the easiest approach, it is not essentially where the ethical foundations or underpinnings should necessarily be founded. And I find that concept of the move fast and break things theory of the tech culture, thankfully, I think the industry is shifting away from that, and they've realized maybe that's not the best slogan, especially if maybe it was democracy that was getting broken. We should just move on from that. But yeah, and so go ahead.
I would just sort of say, the tech, one of the IBM executives wrote a book called The End of the Tech Companies. And the message there is that how every company is a tech company, right? So when we talk about tech company, and I know some of the issues that probably exist, we have to understand the context behind those companies and how did this happen. Things happen so fast that organizations were really focused on creating products. The reason why I was setting up the conversation in a way where we have a set of macro codes and a company objectives, principles, goals, and our products and services and our culture will just follow that. I think what has happened in the boom and bust cycle of tech, we kind of skipped through some of those steps. And I would say, the digital native companies, IBM, and I'm in the business of modernization legacy organizations like our banks, our insurance, our governments, and so on. The digital native companies moved so fast to capture market share. We bypassed some of those foundational core things that I would say some of the legacy companies had it right, because otherwise they wouldn't survive hundreds of years. So I think we have to think about, when we say tech companies, there's so many different segments, and there's a lot of issues on the legacy companies that are going through their own reinvention. But I would say, as the entrepreneurs are listening in, you've got to find the right balance of how much effort do you use to set the culture, the objectives, the values of your organization, while you're figuring out your product market and founder fit. I advise a lot of startups. I understand how stretched out they are, how thin they are. But I think now they're in 2020 and we have lots of lessons learned. what is probably hopefully obvious to most of the listeners here, brand would create a huge accelerator in your market share capture. So protecting that brand with everything we're talking about is going to be equally important as finding the product market fit.
But with due respect to tech companies and others, what has been the massive problem is that they have treated customers' personal information, which is under their control, as their information to do with as they wish. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. You may have custody and control over someone's data. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the data subject, your customers. And you have to treat that with respect. That's why, you know, in the last 2 years, concern for privacy is at an all-time high. I've been in this business a long time. I've never seen consistently concern for privacy at the 90 percentile. 90% very concerned about their privacy. 92% concerned about loss of control over their personal information. They've had it. They just cannot tolerate the abuses of their information and the uses that it's put to for secondary uses that they've never consented to, would never consent to. And so all of this creates enormous havoc with your customers. And that's why there's such a trust deficit right now. And it's growing because until companies understand that the information you may possess on your customers doesn't belong to you. So give them access to their data and ensure that you have the proper consent to use it in the ways for which it was intended. And once again, it's not privacy versus business interests. It's both. They complement each other. So if you don't go into it with that mindset, you're going to have massive troves of data that it's going to come back to bite you. Data breaches are growing. Privacy complaints in the courts are huge. They're class action lawsuits, not just lawsuits. So you're making an enormous problem for your company if you don't address these issues up front.
And you made a point of us versus their data, and basically how we even conceptualize data ownership as internet users or as company owners in that way. And I know, Pavel, you brought up on a past call, we have new kind of future-focused approaches to data ownership around maybe like data dividends or even other concepts about data trusts. And so what are some basically forward-looking features that can be brought to this data and privacy conversation that work and operate under those lines, that where you can retain ownership of the data you are leaving as you search online?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about assuming an organization has set up their values, the principles. I spend a lot of time around ethical AI principles, and there's lots that are being published, which is great to see from different stakeholders. But now it's about how do you get into these practices as you're building those different types of digital products inside. But how do we really, go towards data monetization discussion in a transparent, fair, and accountable way? I think that's perhaps the macro message. And there are many opportunities, I believe, that it will create for entrepreneurs to monetize data within those guiding principles. One of the examples that I've seen, and a startup called Delphia, a Toronto-based startup, and they're kind of promoting this concept of data dividends. And I personally sort of fond of the concept. I'm sure there's a lot to figure out. It is early, but this notion is we operate in a marketplace right now where companies spend significant amount of resources to understand demand signals, to figure out right product to customer fit, the pricing strategies, and so on. These are all prediction. Every company is trying to predict these things, speculate these things, and we are sort of buying data, or we are sort of speculating to be able to understand demand signals better so that we can get the right product, the right price point in front of them. So I would call the market is pushing to the consumer, the current sort of model. Well, what if, and we should I think continue to do that, and we should do that, all of that within the guiding principles that we're talking about, within the regulations, within the corporate objectives, within the data and AI principles. But how do we perhaps also look at an alternative business model where instead of being pushed products to me as a consumer, I want to be able to pull products and services to me. And it's an opt-in option. If I want to do that, then I will do so. And I will do so in certain platforms. And I will share what I want to share with the world as a consumer that I find might be beneficial for the world to present products at the right price point at the right time to me. And in exchange, I would like at the end of the year, some type of credit or a dividend, so that as a society, perhaps we can be more efficient in how product finds consumers and the right price points. But at the same time, the data owners, to Anne's point, they also get the dividend that they deserve for sharing that information in a marketplace. So I think that would be the macro trend that I'm seeing. And I think there's a huge potential for entrepreneurs to create organizations, companies to participate and enable that facilitation of data.
And I agree with you, Pavel. I think that's a great model. The idea of data dividends or ownership, obtaining some funding for the use of your data, whatever the model is. And the individual can decide if they want to do this or not. They're in control. They can make those decisions, but there should be some benefit offered to them for the use of their data. Whereas right now, it's largely lacking. And it's just being extracted without any benefits being returned. And that's what people object to. So if you build in some data dividends or whatever the model is, then some return goes back to the customers, to the data subjects. And when we talk about AI or machine learning or any of those things, we have to really keep our eyes peeled for this, because those are often the areas where the customers can't look under the hood. They're not going to know what you're doing. So transparency, accountability is absolutely critical. And having some models, I created something called AI ethics by design. It's an extension of my privacy by design to the area of artificial intelligence, because our algorithmic oversight and responsibility has to be assured by third parties who can look at this and make assessments that they can convey to consumers, etc. So all of this has to be built in, and we can do it, and it's just beginning now.
I would, agree, Anne. In the discussions of AI, maybe we hone in a little bit on AI here. Hopefully, this is beneficial for the listeners. I think there are, obviously, this space is moving very, very fast. There's lots of research happening. We have to understand what is still, where the science is still in progress. For example, explainability is a big topic and still in the domain of research. There are lots of progresses being made, and all other major organizations, including IBM, is actually releasing a lot of codes around explainability, yes, so that people can, entrepreneurs can leverage that. The point that I was going to make is that, we cannot explain all human decisions. So we should understand that we will not be able to explain all AI decisions as we speak now, because it's not possible, technically not possible yet. But it doesn't mean that we cannot continue to make progress on it. It's still a topic of research. There's still a lot of resourcing that's going into to be able to find that. But there are other areas that's equally important as explainability. Things like, transparency, which everybody can subscribe to now. There are actually lots of work going on. For example, Partnership on AI is producing some great collateral called About ML, how developers and designers and data scientists and engineers can basically follow a standard of transparency. When you build something, this is how you document things. Accountability we can do now. There's no reason we should not be paying attention to those. Other things like fairness, robustness, value alignment. Those big topics are still in big research domain where we need to chip away at it. And I would say explainability falls in the middle of that, where a lot of it we can do now, but there's a lot that research is still in progress.
I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that. We can't understand AI is what it is. We're never going to be able to find all the ways in which it works or whatever. I'm paraphrasing. There was a decision in the courts last year. Supreme Court of Canada ruled in favor of this Indigenous character who was up for parole. He was in jail. He was up for parole and he applied. And they used an AI algorithm to determine the likelihood of recidivism. Would he recidivate or not? And they decided, yep, he was a high likelihood of recidivism, so they didn't grant him parole. He got a really good lawyer who looked under the hood at the AI, and they found that the decisions made on the AI by the AI were based on a population that didn't reflect him. It was primarily Black individuals, people of color, no Indigenous characters. So the court said, the Supreme Court ruled that we can't use this. This is ridiculous. Don't tell us we can't understand how this works because it's AI. Forget it. We looked under the hood, we looked at the code, and it doesn't apply to this gentleman. And I thought that set a very good example because, I work with so many people, brilliant data scientists and computer guys, and say, wow, you can't understand that. Nonsense. I'm not asking you to explain every piece of the code, but you have to have a fundamental understanding of how it's working and the kind of instructions you've issued to the machine learning in order to make it work, et cetera, for the AI. So that's an area that I reject, but people are just saying, well, we can never really understand how it works.
So, and maybe, these are the right debates to have. I actually don't think we're even debating. I think we are just perhaps talking about different buckets. So if you think about a simple layer of cakes, where at the bottom of the layer is data, the next layer is, let's call this sort of AI. On top of that, you have process. On top of that, you have governance. And on top of that, you just have good human judgment. What I am talking about is, in the AI layer, there's still some research outstanding to figure it out, but we can certainly solve the data collection biases. We can certainly solve how we design processes. We can certainly solve how you govern and how do you apply human judgment to this decision. So when it comes to such a high stake use cases, like somebody's going to go to prison,
yes,
or these are high stake issues. A black box AI should not be making a decision.
right?
This should not be even in scope of that discussion,
Yeah.
right? Now, there are a lot of rule-based things that you can implement, which is very, very explainable. But this issue that you just brought up is actually not about AI or rules. It's actually about the biases in data collection.
Yes.
And the process and the governance layer, which we have no excuses for.
I totally agree with you. And my motto has always been trust but verify. So
Yeah.
whenever I'm working with computer scientists, data scientists, etc., I always say, I have to look under the hood. Walk me through the code. And recently, unrelated to this example, but Apple, Google just put together a framework, exposure notification framework to be used, created an app for COVID-19 to be alerted. And it's amazing. But again, Apple knows me very well. And they literally, they walked me through all the code on 2 separate occasions. They walked me through exactly what they had did, how it worked, just everything in terms of looking under the hood. They know that's how I work. And then I had enormous trust in the app that they created, the API. And in Ontario, which is where I reside, I worked with the Ontario government to create the COVID alert app, which is amazing. No personal information is collected, no geolocation data, nothing. But that's the level of examination you need for things like that to really ensure that it's doing what it says it's doing. And that's the level of authentication I require.
Makes sense.
Since it was brought up, I think now could be a time to then kind of talk about the governance or kind of regulatory aspect to this whole conversation. Since Pavel, you just mentioned, you know, we can correct for biases in data collection in terms of where regulation, especially around if we're talking about court sentencing, artificial intelligence, things along those lines. And so what aspects of this conversation do you see a role in a well-informed regulatory body being able to facilitate some of this, whether it's increasing transparency as much as, you know, the market itself can produce efficiencies. I think in terms of when it comes to transparency or things that might not have an immediate effect on business value, it's a bit harder to convince people. So what are some areas you see of regulation playing an effect, and B, of how companies should kind of respond to that?
There has to be complete transparency. And when I say that, you know, people go, yeah, sure, lady. Yes, when I was Privacy Commissioner of Ontario for 3 terms, we worked with lots of organizations, and then we got PHIPAA, the Personal Health Information Protection Act, which extended privacy protection into hospitals, doctors, medical, etc. And the whole point was to have a true understanding of how things worked in terms of when I think of PHIPAA and the hospitals that we worked with, etc. There had to be an understanding of how people's personal health information would be used, to whom it would be disclosed, in what restricted way, where consent was absolutely required on a positive basis, or no consent because the person's going to die if you don't send him to surgery immediately. You know, those kind of nuances. So all of that has to be played out. And it can be played out in the corporate world, wherever, because the whole thing of, when you think of AI and the amazing ways in which it's going to operate, somebody has to have an idea of how to walk through it. And I don't say that lightly, because I'm not suggesting this is easy to do. But if you don't have some kind of algorithmic oversight into these amazing areas, you're going to have huge problems and privacy infractions. I mean, that's a given. And obviously you want to avoid that. So regulators, I'm sure privacy commissioners, I mean, the Federal Privacy Commissioner of Canada has been amazing in wanting to ensure that things work the way they're supposed to work. You know, he's gone to great lengths to try to upgrade our data PIPEDA, which has been around since the early 2000s, federal private sector legislation. And these changes, God willing, will be coming, but the federal government drags its heels like unbelievably. So that's why increasingly I say, don't focus just on the law. It's too little, too late. Build in privacy protective measures by design, bake it into the code, embed it up front, and be very open and transparent about what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, and I'm coming from the, I guess, the technologists and the business owners side, and I think regulation is going to be important here. I think it's going to be important here. I'm actually in this conversation, and we were just prepping for the discussions before. This topic, if I can sort of at a macro level, is at the same importance of nuclear proliferation and climate change.
Yeah.
Let's summarize the ethical deployment of data and technology. These 3 things are at the same sort of macro conversations right now.
Yes.
And we know what happened on the first one, like where we haven't bombed each other up. So there was a lot of regulations, a lot of collaborations, a lot of things happened. Climate change, we're witnessing as we speak. There's so much going on. Mark Carney, who I'm sure some of you are familiar with, issued yesterday. He thinks all the bank executives should get paid based on their progress towards the Paris goal. So we're starting to see a lot of sort of, I would say, movement around climate change. And I think this topic, let's call it technology, privacy, ethics, data implementation, how climate change probably took 40, 50, 60 years of discussions to get to where we are today. I think this will happen at COVID speed. I think we would need regulations. But I think, as entrepreneurs listening, and I don't know how you guys are feeling about, these conversations, I would go back to what are the value drivers? Why are we doing this? It's got to be tied to business value creation, which in this era, your brand and your consumer, your user base, trusting your brand is going to be as important as a product market fit, right?
Yes.
So these are not topics that, oh man, I got to deal with these regulatory requirements. These are like, I need to do this because I want to make sure my brand is well positioned for that market.
Absolutely.
And there is going to be regulatory requirement. I do think there's some, the appropriate version of the regulation is needed to make the playing field. Go ahead.
If I may, and I don't disagree with you, but we can't wait for regulation. We can't. We've been waiting forever. As I said, the federal private sector legislation enacted in 2004. I mean, we're still going to wait another 10 years, I'm sure, to have it upgraded. It's ridiculous. The Federal Privacy Commissioner has been begging Trudeau for the past 5 years, do something. Yeah. So it's not that I disagree with you, but we can't rely on that. We need to embed into design the kind of what we're talking about now. And we can do this. And if I can just add one thing, you mentioned COVID. My enormous concern with COVID is this has happened so many times from 2000, 9/11, when that happened. And every time there's an emergency, it's like, oh, we need public safety. Forget about privacy. We need to go with public safety. It's always that zero-sum mindset of privacy versus whatever, and privacy always loses. I'm not suggesting privacy should win over public safety, but I'm sure as hell not going to let it lose out every time. Privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. You cannot have the COVID concerns now eradicate people's privacy, because COVID's going to end, but the eradication of our rights will continue. So if we can just get rid of the zero-sum mindset and look for business interests and privacy, we can do both. I work with businesses all the time to get both. It's not one versus another. Just one joke I like to tell. Every year, the Canadian Marketing Association invite me to be their keynote speaker at their annual conference. And I always start by saying, I'm sure I'm the least popular speaker here today. And fortunately, they laugh. But then they say, yeah, but we know we got to hear what you have to say. So it's both. Privacy is not anti-marketing, it's pro-choice.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, if you look at the regulatory requirements, and I think regulators are behind. So, that's why there's actually lots of work going on with industry, business-led, around standard development and so on. Some of the work that I'm doing with IEEE is to develop standards and so on. I think the big question that we should all spend time with, that I think will help this conversation is, assume one is doing privacy, assume one is following ethical principles to deploy data and AI into their businesses to create products. Assume all of that gets us to trust. Then does trust create more profit?
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Oh, there's no question. So when I mentioned privacy by design certification, a number of companies come to me, and with KPMG, they get certified for privacy by design. They said that builds trust like no other, which then builds trusted business relationships. It keeps the customers they have, and it attracts new customers. Their customers talk to their friends and family about how great this is. They offer these great services, and they protect my privacy really strongly. I believe in them. I trust them. It builds business interests, trust, like anything, like no other, because you need, obviously businesses have to succeed, and that's what we all want, as long as they do that with privacy. And that's what they found, that privacy enhances trust like no other. And business, you gain a competitive advantage.
So I think if we change the dialogue around how trust can generate more profit,
Yes.
and
Yes.
how data can be valued as an asset in our balance sheets,
Yeah.
and how we want to do that within the macro and the guidelines of the entity, I think we will only be progressing this conversation in a positive direction faster. And then let everybody else catch up, because then we're all chasing the same carrot.
I totally agree with you. And I'm always for the carrot and not the stick. I've always operated like that. When I was privacy commissioner, I had order making power, which was the stick. I could order organizations to change what they're doing and do this instead of that. I rarely used it because the carrot is so much more appealing. You work with the organization, you make it a win-win.
Fantastic. Yeah, I saw some comments come up in the chat, but you got to the topic before I even had to raise them. So yeah, this whole issue on trust and transparency and the relation to profit and trust, I think you summed up really well. So I think in the last kind of few minutes we have here, I would like to talk a bit about like kind of the efficacy of these machine learning and AI things. And I think one thing that often gets lost in the conversation, even around transparency, is maybe some reason why you don't necessarily want to be so transparent about your algorithm that you're running, let's say to serve ads in front of people. It's because they actually aren't effective in getting people to click and buy things. And maybe there was actually a study recently that if you did ad based on the content, rather than the vast array of data you could collect off that individual user and push them ads based on the profile you created, just topic relevant ads so if you're on an outdoors website, let's say you sell an outdoor gear, you almost have the exact same success rate of an end purchase as you would if you spend a lot of money on machine learning and essentially AI-driven ad processing. So I'm interested in trying, like, what do you think the realistic discussion, where does that have the place around when we talk about very complex, very confusing technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence? How much part of the conversation should just be realistic about what can be accomplished by these things and not maybe get too distracted by all of the carrots being dangled in front of us?
You know, I often think that sometimes we complicate things unnecessarily. And I would love to simplify in some areas. For example, if you have a customer base and you're trying to figure out the profile, what to send to them and advertising, etc., I always say to companies, why don't you just ask them what they're interested in. What would they like to receive? I know the kinds of things I really welcome getting in terms of additional information relating to certain aspects of data protection, what they're doing in the EU compared to somewhere else. So I know exactly the list I would give to anyone who asked me. But I have friends who also say, I know what I want more of. I need more in this area. You know, I sew or I cook or I do this or I like business interests. Just ask people and then they will love it. You know, involving the data subject, the customer, in these decisions, I think goes such a long way. And for whatever reason, that's underestimated right now. And that's the direction I would push. It also allows the individual, the customer, to feel like they're part of the whole operation, which they love to do. So involve them and make it a win-win operation.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're agreeing on everything, Anne. We should
Oh my God.
have some debate. I think what we were talking about, creation of business models, I think there's a lot of opportunity right now to create those platforms so that consumers and product creators can actually exchange information in some type of central standard way, because you can imagine there are thousands of companies that are trying to create their products and services, finding the right target set. They don't know, they're still in the hunt for figuring out the right customer segmentation and so on. There is opportunity to kind of create forums and platforms where information could be shared to kind of at the idea generation stage, I would say seed, pre-seed stage, where entrepreneurs are trying to understand the key problems that their customer sets might be trying to solve. There's got to be an incentive for that customer set to be there and share that information. So I think there's an opportunity there to kind of facilitate in terms of monetization of data, not just from, let's say, individual consumers, but also other entities who have invested significant on digital, but are actually not monetizing and getting the ROI back, right? A lot of people have invested a lot of money on technology just to, move from, let's say, from paper to a workflow, but they haven't really figured out how to apply intelligence to do that better, or stop doing that in the first place, or monetize information that's kind of in the dark world right now, whether it's in different types of structured and unstructured environments. How do you really monetize? So maybe that would be a second kind of sort of idea, like how help us monetize this data.
Yes.
Obviously,
Yes.
all agree on guiding principles and rules and so on, but kind of having a more productive conversation that way, because that will drive discussions in the right directions.
Agreed.
And again, and on the AI ML sort of technical aspect of things, as we were talking about, some things we can do immediately, like transparency and accountability. Some things are in the middle around explainability, and some things are still big ideas like value alignment, right? A machine knowing what's good versus bad. We are far away from that, right? We still have very narrow AI, right? We don't really have, AGI kind of capability.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. We're not even close to AGI, and that's often what people think of when we talk about AI. But people don't understand that it's artificial general intelligence that we're thinking about.
Most people are calling logistic regression AI, but it's narrow AI, and it doesn't have that much capability, really, to be honest.
That's right.
But we are going to probably all of us live in a world where that code that was driving that car can also make your pasta, and that could happen.
I love it.
That would be an AGI, but we should figure out the value alignment technical issue over there. So I would just park those three big thoughts.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you both. Yeah, fantastic hearing from you. I'm gonna just have a few questions from the chat here to round out our time. So, and we have one around privacy by design certification and about certification for like more venture-based, or I guess like, startups without a massive amount of capital. If there's any type of certification that either you do or that you know of that's similar.
So what I would suggest, if you're a startup, what I would start by doing is, and I'm happy to talk to any startups if they want just some initial guidance, because that's the ideal time to embed. There are 7 foundational principles to privacy by design, and I can walk them through it. And when you're just a startup, it's relatively easy to do because you don't have a ton of data and procedures, et cetera, staff. So at the ideal time to introduce privacy by design is at the startup stage. And then once you're down the road, large companies, for example, want to get certified because it strengthens their brand. And at that point, if you want to get certified, you can contact me. I'll put you in touch with the senior partner at KPMG who does the certifications, and then we can work things out. But the startup time is the ideal time. Take a look at the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design. It's on my website, and then I can help walk you through if you want.
Thanks, Anne. And Pavel, I'll pose this one to you in terms of probably, the big data related AI and cloud related processing you work on. And that is around kind of data governance, and feel free to chime in as well, as this was also a previous topic of you, but data governance around health data, and how is there a way to use that data safely that can then create efficiencies around healthcare systems, or to how we diagnose or identify, especially in the area of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the reality is we cannot afford not to use data and intelligence in any sector. Like I think we all need to do that simply because that would be progress. So in healthcare, it's a huge topic. The inefficiency in the system, how patients are. We're giving everybody Tylenol because we hope that's going to work versus this concept of push versus pull. So being very precision medicine. There's so many applications. So I hope nobody's even thinking about this. That should be used in health. Go ahead, Anne. You were going to say something.
Yeah. Oh, no, you finished, Papa.
Yeah. I would just say, everything we talked about is very applicable in healthcare. Obviously, there are a lot more sensitivity around the kind of data we're talking about, the data ownership that Anne promotes, and I'm fully subscribed to that, and all the guidelines and procedures that we need to have. But if we want to do it, we know how to do it. I debate with my wife all the time. I mean, if I believe in the bank to protect my money, I can believe in the hospital to protect my data, or I can believe in the government to protect my data.
I'm sorry.
No.
And here's why I want to challenge that, because first of all, in the hospitals, the laws we have in place, I'm talking about Ontario PHIPAA, you cannot use people's personal information unless it's related to their medical health and care. But what you can do is you can de-identify the data. There's enormous value if you strongly de-identify data, meaning you strip all the personal identifiers. You still have the value of the data, but it's not linked to an identifiable individual in a way that can come back to haunt them. And I assure you, when I was privacy commissioner, so many things would haunt you in terms of people having unauthorized access to your health data or other identifiable data. So it's not that I disagree with you, Pavel. I would just say, absolutely, the value of data is enormous, but we have to strongly de-identify data, and there are ways to do that. That way you get the value of the data without any risk to privacy or to the individual.
Makes sense.
Oh, can I mention one more thing?
Please do, Anne, yeah.
There are so many wonderful forms of encryption. We haven't had a chance to talk about encryption yet. One of my favorites is something called Homomorphic Encryption, which is amazing because it enables you to engage in analytics on encrypted data within the encrypted sphere. You never have to strip it of the encryption and leave it exposed. You can do it in the encrypted sphere. So just look that up, Homomorphic Encryption. It's fabulous.
Fantastic. And I learned something today, which I will definitely be going to research after. Great. Well, yeah, I think any last comments from either of you? You'd like to summarize kind of the points we talked about today? Otherwise, yeah, we can turn it over to a Q&A on Instagram.
I'll go to if there's any questions on the chat. I mean, if we have addressed them all.
Sure. I'm happy to do questions as well on the chat because Pavel and I could keep talking forever.
Yeah. Well, so then how about we go? So you both mentioned the idea of opt-in data sharing model so that individuals might be provided with a dividend or a credit. How far do you think we are from having a policy that makes this possible?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would say it's still at a big idea stage. We are starting to see examples of it. So in my mind, it's the notion of data monetization, both for large organization. So similarly, how you have, if you are a manufacturing company and you have inventory, and whatever the inventory is worth, it's on your balance sheet. In my opinion, we need to be working towards in the corporate balance sheet, a line items that says, your data is worth X billion dollars, and that contributes to your overall valuation of the company. because then that would be the carrot that everybody would be worked towards to do things right, just like how we do things for physical inventory. So that's for corporations. For individuals, the data dividend is that that concept, right? That, you know, me as an individual, I have expertise and time to contribute, but I also have data to contribute to the world. How do I exchange that, and how do I get monetized for it? I would say right now we're also seeing a lot of activity by different government agencies, as governments are also thinking about how do you monetize data, again, within the requirements and the principles that we hold each of these entities. So so overall, the general message is that data monetization is an opportunity for public, private, and individual entities.
I totally agree with you, Pavel. And it's just starting. We're just at the early stages now. But I think what it does for companies is it really shows them that data has enormous value, and that they have to be very respectful of people's data and the whole data monetization idea, data dividends. And for individuals, they can decide what they want to do with their data. Do they want to extract value, or do they just want to retain it? Do they want, I mean, it returns control back to the individual. And along with something else called SSI, self-sovereign identity, this is growing dramatically now. Combine that with decentralized identity, I think you're going to see a lot of developments where people's privacy, their identification, will have value to it in a way that is lacking right now, and that will enhance the respect for privacy and data protection.
I can't think of a better point to leave it at than on that point. And so I want to thank Pavel, and thank you so much again. Very enlightening conversation. And yeah, I'm sure this conversation can continue on for hours, but we'll transfer over to Heather to wrap up.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I just want to say thank you to Pavel and Anne and to Sam. Thanks for joining our very first in our Pivot speaker series.